Megan Collins. I'm a senior staff attorney with Disability Rights Florida. I've been working with Disability Rights Florida or other protection and advocacies out of the state since 2013 when I started as a legal intern. I also worked with the protection and advocacy in Connecticut, and now I'm back here. I do work on a number of different grants, but special education is where my heart is. And we at Disability Rights Florida also do birth all the way through life. So we represent on any number of issues, but like I said, special ed's really where my heart is, and so I love getting a chance to demystify it for parents and students. So, like I said, we're going to cover the IEP process and the different acronyms that get thrown around during that process. We're going to talk about identification for special education, the evaluation process, eligibility for an IEP, drafting an IEP, and IEP amendments. So it's the language of special education. Just quickly, Disability Rights Florida is a nonprofit. We're funded by federal grant money. Our services are completely free to individuals with disabilities, and like I said, we represent birth all the way through life on issues with education, employment, access to the community. If it's an issue that impacts the civil rights of a person with a disability, we can help with that. We have offices in Tallahassee, Tampa, Hollywood, and Gainesville, but we travel all around the state, and so if there's an issue in the state of Florida affecting a person with a disability, it's fair game. Our mission is to advance quality of life, dignity, equality, self-determination, and freedom of choice for people with disabilities through collaboration, education, advocacy, legal, and legislative strategies. The legal authority for the IEP topics that we're going to cover today comes from primarily the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. It's a federal law that provides students with disabilities certain protections with regard to their education. The Florida Department of Education also issued technical assistance and guidance with regard to some of the concepts defined in the IDEA, and there are also some State Board of Education rules that are relevant. So I have some links later on as to different websites where you can find some of this information, but just so you know, I'm not making this up, this is where it came from. So first, the IDEA. The IDEA is a federal law, like I said. It gives eligible children with disabilities certain protections and rights with regard to special education and related services. The IDEA covers students from birth to age 21. There are a couple different parts, and the part that the majority of these acronyms come from would be part B of the IDEA, or part C rather, of the IDEA. So many of the acronyms that come on the next couple pages are defined in the IDEA, and it also outlines avenues that parents can follow if their rights or their students' rights aren't followed with regard to services. It provides students with disabilities a right to those services, and students and parents the right to due process. Child find is an obligation in the IDEA that requires districts to identify, locate, and evaluate children with disabilities who are in need of special education and related services. Basically what that means is a district is responsible for ensuring that the students in its district are provided with appropriate services. And if a student is struggling, and if a student needs assistance, then the district is responsible for finding and evaluating that child and providing that assistance. It includes children who are progressing from grade to grade. So progression is not a factor that would rule out special education eligibility. You can be getting good grades, you can be progressing from grade to grade, but you could be struggling socially, emotionally, you could be struggling with your speech language or your communication skills. And so you would be a student that the district would have a child find obligation to locate and provide services to. Thank you. RTI, response to intervention. It's a part of the evaluation procedure. It's not the whole procedure. So response to intervention came about because there was a trend where it was thought that there was an over-identification of students with disabilities and that students maybe weren't being exposed to curriculum and given a chance to be successful. And so the idea of response to intervention is before you find a child eligible for special education, you need to see whether they've been given a high-quality education, and you need to try and support them as much as you can before finding them eligible for certain services. And so it's supposed to look at students that are struggling and starting with Tier 1, which is students in the general education classroom. Does the student need a little bit more support? If they do need a little bit more support, are they able to get to where they need to be, and maybe they don't need special education services. Maybe they just hadn't gone to preschool and hadn't learned their letters versus the rest of the kindergarten class had, that kind of thing. Or do they still need more instruction, in which case we put them on tier 3 of RTI. And if they need sufficient, a high level of services over a significant amount of time in order to see success, then RTI is a process that allows us to say this is a student who might need more support. This is a student who really needs specially designed instruction, not just regular supports and services in a regular classroom. It looks at data, it looks at the instruction provided, and it's an informal assessment of skills to see whether a student needs special education. The goal is to intervene and to determine and start helping students before they fall behind or before they are failing to make progress. It's not an evaluation, it can't be used to delay an evaluation. So a lot of times districts will maybe have this misconception that you can't start an evaluation process until after you've completed RTI, or, well, we have to try this first. That's not the case at all. Parents can request an evaluation at any time. So although on the last slide I said there's a child-find obligation for districts to find and identify children, if you as a parent think that your child hasn't been identified or think that the district may be missing something with regard to services, you can certainly reach out to them and ask if they start that evaluation process, and they can't delay or deny that based on the response to intervention process. So evaluations. It's a process used to determine whether a child's learning strengths and needs, what those are, and to determine whether the child is eligible for special education. You have to do a full and individual initial evaluation before discussing eligibility. And the thought behind full and individual is you can't look at a student and evaluate only a specific area. Because a student might be having behavioral problems, but you don't just evaluate behavior because behavior is a form of communication. Are they having behavior because they are nonverbal, don't know sign language, don't have an assistive technology device, and they have no other way to communicate with you other than through their actions? If you just looked at behavior, you might not be able to determine that this student doesn't have language skills, and so doing a full evaluation, you would determine, yes, the student has a behavioral need, but they also have a reading comprehension problem, and they also have a problem with speech and language, and they also have, you would identify all the different areas of need that a student has and be able to better meet those needs and serve the individual student. As I said before, a parent can request an evaluation. The state educational agency, so Florida Department of Education, could also initiate it. Another state agency could initiate it, so if the Division of Blind Services is involved and they come to your IEP meeting, they can recommend or request the school district as a member of the IEP team to start that evaluation, or the local education agency, which is your district. If you as a parent request an evaluation and your local education agency, so the school district, refuses, they have to provide you prior written notice of their refusal. And that's not just a form that says they refuse. They have to explain, and you can make them document why they don't believe that that is necessary. If an agency requests an evaluation, before beginning, they have to get your consent. So if the school district wants to evaluate your child, they have to get your permission. You have to sign off on that. That doesn't mean that you consent to placement. So for example, if your student isn't identified and the district requests to do an evaluation, that doesn't mean that they can start providing services. That just means they can evaluate, and then the team would have to reconvene and you would have to separately sign for services. If your child's already eligible for services and the district says, we want to do a behavior evaluation, previously there were no behavioral concerns, but now we're starting to see some, that doesn't automatically mean that they are authorized to provide behavior supports. Again, it only is consent for the evaluation, and you have to reconvene as a team and discuss whether the team, not just the school, determines that the student needs additional services. So, a student with a disability is a child who's been evaluated and meets specific eligibility criteria from the IDEA or state statute. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what the disability category is. It's just a way to get in the door and get services. So you could be a student who has communication needs. You are a child who's deaf and you can't hear and you don't speak. And so you have communication needs, you need to learn American Sign Language. But because you haven't been able to communicate, you've developed behaviors, you're not able to express yourself any other way. So even though your eligibility would be deaf, hard of hearing on your IEP, you could still have a behavioral plan and you could still address behavior, because it's something that impacts your education, separate from that and related to that eligibility category. The main steps that we follow are, 1, the child has a disability. 2, because of that disability, they're unable to access general education. 3, and so they need specially designed instruction. And those are the 3 kind of check boxes you would look at when determining eligibility. I didn't put it this way because I think I hesitate to add extra acronyms on my own, but I have seen this abbreviated as SWD, students with a disability. So just kind of in the back of your mind, know that that is another kind of alphabet soup term you might see. So an IEP, an Individualized Education Program, it's a written plan that describes the student's needs and how we're going to support them and meet their needs. It's developed at an IEP meeting, and the parents, child, educators, professionals, anyone who has relevant information to discussing the child's needs and how to meet them, comes to that meeting and discusses the information that they have and how they think that child needs to be supported. You discuss present level of performance. You discuss needs and educational strategies that help the student access the curriculum. You discuss the services to be provided, who's going to provide those services, and how long those services need to last. So some students need services only during the regular school year. Some students need services in the summer. Some students need services during the regular school year, the summer, winter break, spring break, before and after school. It just depends on their individual needs, and those are all discussions that should be had by the IEP team. An IEP is designed to be reviewed at least annually, so there should be at least 1 meeting with the IEP team per year. In addition to that meeting, you should be getting kind of quarterly progress reports. But if you are seeing something, you have the right to request an additional IEP meeting if there are changes in your child's behavior, or if there's a significant lack of change in behavior or progress, something like that, then you would be able to request a meeting. So at least once a year, but more than that as necessary. And parents are important members of the team. So the IEP should include present levels of educational and functional performance. So independent living skills, communication, things like that, those are also important. Those are also parts of the IEP. It should include measurable, which is a key word here, educational goals and short-term instructional objectives. So you wouldn't just have make progress in reading as an educational goal. You would have Timmy is at X reading level. He's at, let's say, 3.5 grade level in reading. So 3rd grade, halfway through in reading. And that would be his present level of performance. Then when you look at his measurable educational goal, you want to make at least a year's progress in a year. So your goal would be something like, at a minimum, Timmy will, using such and such reading strategies, will increase his reading level from a 3.5 grade level to a 4.5 grade level. And then your measurable objectives might be something like, Timmy will work on comprehension, Timmy will work on reading fluency, Timmy will work on, and it would identify things. And what I find is helpful is to go to the general education standards for that grade level and look at what type of criteria they're looking for students to master during that grade, and not necessarily the grade the student's in, but the grade the student's working at, and to look at using those as your objectives, your benchmarks, and your goal in order to see the student progressing on that path. The IEP should also include modifications and accommodations that a child needs to participate in general education. So for example, if a student needs to be accommodated by having their service animal with them during the school day, or if a student needs to have only classes on the 1st floor of a school building because they're in a wheelchair and the school doesn't have an elevator, things like that. Special education and related services. So does a student, in order to work on their IEP goals, need to be pulled out of class? Does a teacher need to be pushed in? Does the student need speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy? It should also include the date that services will begin and end, and the frequency. So it's not enough to just say 30 minutes of reading. Is that per week? Is that bi-weekly? Is that monthly? And it's really important that it be as specific as possible, even if the district says, well, that's just standard, reading weekly. Well, how much reading weekly? And even if they understand it, you might move. You might move to another school, you might move to another district, you might move to another state. And your child still has a right to special education, and your child still has a right to the same services that they're supposed to receive on their IEP. But if that IEP can't be picked up and understood by anyone who reads it, it's not an effective strategy for your child to get an education. And then transition services needs. Beginning at age 14, you should start working with the team to discuss what your child's going to do after high school. Are they going to get a job? Are they going to go to college? Are they going to do something else? And how are they going to get there? If your child wants to go to college but they're not able to live independently, are there steps that you can take between age 14 and age 21 in order to get them there? Because again, eligibility is through age 21. Are there classes they can take? Are there summer programs they can attend? Do they need, if they're going to a job, do they need services in order to make them employable? Do they need a job coach? Things like that. So the IEP will list the needs, the services, and the goals. It'll start with the present level of performance because that gives you kind of a baseline where the student's at, and then you build from there what the student needs in order to be successful. It has to have those annual goals, and they have to be measurable and related to educational needs. The group of people who discuss the IEP are called the IEP team. It includes parents and guardians. You are first on this list because you are a required member, and a lot of times I think districts forget that and parents don't know it, and so I put it up at the top of the list because from the beginning you are needed to be involved in every IEP meeting. Regular education teachers, if the child is or might be in regular education. So even if a child is in a self-contained classroom, if the child might move into general education, or it might be a discussion, then there needs to be a general education teacher there. There always needs to be a special education teacher and provider. There needs to be a member from the LEA, which is Local Educational Agency, who's familiar with the resources. So there should never be a discussion at an IEP meeting that results in, we can't make that decision. We have to get in touch with such and such. They need to have someone there who's familiar with the resources and able to make those kind of decisions. And if that person isn't available there, then what I do is I have them call that person on the phone or initiate steps to get in touch with that person during the meeting, because the meeting shouldn't be held up and the provision of services shouldn't be held up because they didn't follow their obligation to have the necessary people there. And then if appropriate, the child should be there. The way I like to look at it and work on it with my clients is from the beginning of their IEP eligibility. I like to have the child involved at least in some capacity, at least through an interview or a little discussion at the beginning of the meeting. I don't think it's productive always for children to be there during the eligibility process, and I don't think it's always productive for them to be there during the discussion of specific present levels, because oftentimes those discussions can be contentious or could focus most on what the child is unable to do. I think it's really helpful, though, for the child to be able to be there to explain their own needs, explain the way that they see the services they're getting and the services they think they need, and to explain themselves and their unique needs and interests to the IEP team. And so I think when the students are younger, it's helpful for them to put together a collage or a PowerPoint if they're technologically inclined, in order to go over, this is me, this is who I am, this is how I learned, and participate in their meeting and work on becoming a self-advocate. As they get a little older, it might be appropriate for them to stay for more and more of the meeting. Especially my high school kids, I really want them to be there to be discussing their goals and the services that they need, because it doesn't make sense for me to sit at a meeting and advocate for accommodations or modifications that involve extended test time if my client doesn't want to leave the classroom to take the test somewhere else because they don't want to look different than their peers. I spent all that time advocating for something and they're not going to use it. So it does at that point start to make more and more sense. And especially as they're getting to that age, they're either going to go to employment or college after this. If they want to do that, then they need to be able to be a self-advocate, and it's important for them to start practicing those skills. So FBA and BIP. An FBA is a functional behavior assessment. It looks at the ABCs of behavior. The antecedent, what was happening before, the behavior, what you did in response to whatever was happening before, and the consequence, what happened after you exhibited that behavior. So for example, if I start crying, what happened before I started crying that might have made me cry? And then the behavior was that I was crying. And then the consequence, what happened after? Did someone run over to me to offer me assistance? Did someone get me a box of tissues? Did someone ask me if I wanted to leave the room? What happened? What did I do? What happened after? And behavior is communication. And so we look at behavior because we look at why is a student doing something and what are they getting out of it. An FBA is then used to create a behavior intervention plan. So for example, if a student is crying, to be able to leave the classroom because they realize every time they cry, they get sent out to the hallway. So that behavior for escape. If a child is crying and every time they cry, someone comes over to them and gives them attention, is that a cry for attention? And what can you replace that with that would be more appropriate? Because it isn't necessarily appropriate to just break down into tears constantly in the classroom. Can the child work towards asking when they need a break? Can the child, and maybe first, can they identify when they need a break? Can they use a card to indicate they need to leave? If they want attention, can they learn to ask for that in an appropriate way? A behavior intervention plan is also sometimes called a positive behavior intervention plan, and I like the emphasis on the word positive because a lot of times there's a focus on a response to behavior that is more negative, such as restraint and seclusion. That should never be part of a behavior intervention plan under the IDEA. Behavior intervention plans should replace negative behaviors with more positive behaviors. They should not punish children for their behavior because the idea is you're doing the behavior as a result of your disability, and as a student with a disability, you should not be discriminated against. You should not be punished for having a disability, even if that disability makes you exhibit a behavior that would normally be considered unacceptable by a teacher. And so yes, if a teacher might ordinarily give a student a detention for yelling out during class, if a student's yelling out during class because of their disability, it would not be appropriate to give that student a detention. It would not be appropriate to seclude them in a separate part of the classroom. If a student is kicking a chair or a desk because of their disability or throwing a book, it wouldn't be appropriate on their behavior intervention plan to say, when the student throws books, you will restrain the student on the ground with their hands behind their back. Not positive, not an appropriate response to the behavior. What it would instead could say is when a student becomes frustrated, the student begins throwing their books off of their desk. In order to address that behavior, when a student begins to show signs of frustration, the teacher or aide will ask the student whether they need to take a break. And the student will then exit.
Excuse me, can you please repeat your statement because I have to write it down. It was so well said about punishing a person for their disability. I don't know how you said it, but I need to write it down.
I don't know how I said it either.
It was just so well said. Like you can't punish a student.
You can't discriminate against a student on the basis of their disability, and punishing a student for a behavior is punishing them for their disability. That's definitely not how I said it the first time, but it's still true.
Behavior is discriminating based on disability.
Yeah. Peanut Gallery over here is one of my coworkers, and she just said it's a manifestation of a disability.
Yeah, behavior is a manifestation.
Punishing behavior that is a manifestation.
No. Okay. So IEE stands for Independent Educational Evaluation. Parent can request an independent educational evaluation at district expense if they disagree with the school evaluation. So let's say the student is having a behavior of kicking the desk, and the parent says, I want a functional behavior assessment. I want to know what's the antecedent, what's the behavior, what's the consequence of the student kicking the desk. The district does the evaluation, and they find that they have no idea what's causing it. The student's just randomly kicking desks, and they find that there's no consequence, the behavior's not communication, and the parent just says, there's got to be something. They don't go around kicking stuff at home. I disagree with your evaluation. You can request an independent evaluation. If the district agrees to allow you to do that, then they can give you a list of providers, or you can find a provider on your own. You select a provider, and they would do another functional behavior assessment. The district could disagree, and they would then need to initiate what's called a due process hearing in order to defend their evaluation. They would say, the parent has requested this, I don't think it's appropriate. Hearing officer, please find for me that I don't have to do this. Because under the IDEA, they have to provide certain services to students, and if they're going to decline to do that, depending on the type of service, either a parent has a right to request that a hearing officer find that the district must do something, or the district has a right to request from a hearing officer a finding that they don't have to do something. There's also a second circumstance where you can have an independent evaluation. For example, if you go to your primary care doctor for your child's annual physical, and the doctor is talking to you about your child's needs, and it comes out that your child has a new diagnosis from that primary care doctor of diabetes or ADHD or whatever the case might be. you can take that evaluation that your private provider did and you can take it to the school. It's considered an independent evaluation. It was at your own expense because it was happening already. You can take it and the school has to consider it. They don't have to adopt its findings, but they do have to consider it. And if they're not going to adopt the findings, they would have to tell you why. That's that part at the bottom. They're not required to agree with or implement any or all of the results, but they do have to at least consider it. It has to be additional information that the team considers as relevant. If you're going to request an independent educational evaluation at district expense, the district might ask you why you want it, why you think it's necessary. You don't have to explain yourself to them, but I find it's helpful just by creating a paper trail, because if I request a functional behavior assessment through the school because my child is throwing books off of their desk and the district finds that that's not communication, that has nothing to do, there's no pattern they can find, and I say, well, he was doing this at home, this was what it was causing, I disagree with you, my private staff, my private ECBA said this was why my son was doing this, and so the fact that you're not finding that connection in school seems confusing to me. I want an independent evaluation. It helps if I explain that to them, because now they know exactly what I disagree with, exactly what I'm asking for. And even though I don't have to explain myself, it also gives me the documentation. I told them exactly what was wrong with it, hearing officer, and there's clear evidence here that I should have been granted that IEP, and it just helps clear things up. FAPE, free, appropriate, public education. And so I'll break that down. Free means at no cost to the parent. And that's for any service that's educationally relevant. That's for transportation, extended school year, occupational therapy, physical therapy, tutoring, if tutoring is relevant to their free, appropriate public education. It has to be provided at no cost to the parents. Appropriate, meaning to meet the child's individual needs. And that's really the centerpiece of the IDEA is individual needs. So with appropriate, that means, like I just said, tutoring could be one of those services that needs to be provided to a child at no cost to the parent, but only when it's necessary in order for the child to receive their appropriate education. If a student doesn't necessarily need tutoring in order to achieve their appropriate education, then it wouldn't be something that would be covered. So for example, a student who, the reason that a school wouldn't have to pay for tutoring for a child who didn't need it in order to access their education, not appropriate for that student. And there are students who need tutoring who don't need it to access their appropriate education. A lot of students could benefit from tutoring. Public, meaning it's one, at public expense, and two, it meets state educational standards. And that kind of ties into the last part, which is education, so I'll explain them together. Previously, students with disabilities were kept in separate schools, kept in warehouses, kept in basements, not provided education. And the IDEA and a lot of civil rights legislation was in order to correct things that were being done improperly for people, and especially students with disabilities. And so they have to get an education. You can't just be letting them sit in warehouses or in separate closets or wherever the case may be. They have to be provided access to education, and it has to be public. It has to be provided free of cost. It has to be based on the same standards that the state has for other students. We could just be writing off this entire population. It has to be provided to all children with disabilities in the state between 3 to 21. Really, it's birth to 21. There's a birth to 3 component of the IDEA as well. And it includes students who were suspended or expelled. That's really important because a lot of times when students are disciplined, the school district doesn't provide the same type of service or doesn't understand this is an area where a student with a disability needs to be, again, looked at differently. And districts can have this misconception that there's special treatment for students with disabilities or that they get away with murder. And really that's not what it's about. It's about, again, not discriminating against someone on the basis of their disability, because if their behavior was the result of their disability, then they shouldn't be punished for it. They shouldn't be suspended or expelled. Or even if it had nothing to do with their disability, they still aren't a student who can sit at home and work on computer education maybe, and they need to still be provided their IEP services in that environment in order to benefit from their education. Again, no cost to the parent, appropriate to meet the student's needs, and it includes not just education, not just math, reading, but it includes related services like transportation, OT, PT, supplementary aids and services, so communication devices, tablets, computers if that type of thing is necessary, and extended school year services, which, like I said, can be before or after school or during the summer. LRE, least restrictive environment. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, it's to the individual student's least restrictive environment. And so there's a general kind of scale, which starts at general education and then would be maybe push-in services for special education, pull-out services for special education, separate class for special education, separate school for special education, and so on and so forth. And then the farthest end of the spectrum would be education in the hospital or home. There are students who need to be educated in a hospital or home. There are students whose immune systems are so weak that they can't be educated in a school. There are students who are receiving chemotherapy and they can't be exposed to something in a school, or students who have cystic fibrosis and have to be in the hospital for treatments for that. And there are reasons where that would be a student's least restrictive environment, but it's certainly not every student. And it just depends on the unique needs of the students, the sort of sliding scale. It can change during the course of a school year, and it can certainly change during the course of the student's educational career. The bottom there is just, special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of students with disabilities from regular education should occur only when the nature or severity is such that education in the regular class with use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So what that kind of gets to is, just because you need an aid doesn't mean you have to be removed from the general education classroom. Just because you need reading support doesn't mean you have to be removed. Just because you're on access points doesn't mean you have to be removed. It's only when you can't be educated in the regular class with those supplementary aids and services. So students who are deaf and hard of hearing and need an interpreter, or use sign language, or use a hearing device. As long as they have that supplementary aid and service, they could be educated in the general education classroom, and so they wouldn't need to be educated in a separate class. So placement means the program of services, not location. And what that means is general education is general education. You have a right to be in your least restrictive environment, and if your least restrictive environment is general education, then that's where you have a right to be. But you don't necessarily have a right to be with Miss Susie or Mr. Jones or whoever. You have a right to be in general education. Beyond that, you don't get to dictate the particular classroom or the particular school. So if your student's home school has a general education classroom, then that would be where they would go. And if there's a magnet program or something like that, you could change their location. But under the IDEA, the protection is for the type of classroom and not the specific physical classroom. Teacher selection also left to the school. Where it says there, unless there's an essential component to the child's education, so something like that would be, like I was mentioning earlier, student needs only first 4 classes.
Can I ask a question about teachers?
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking for a teacher. I got a teacher complaint the other day. Special needs classroom, 20-year-old students in all special needs. And the question is, the school said Florida does not require special teachers, only life coaches. Is this true?
For students who are 20?
Yeah, because now they're learning life skills, not learning from school, so they're no longer required to have real teachers, just life coaches. Is that correct?
No.
Where would I look something like that up? I've never heard of this, and I didn't even know where to begin.
So I would ask them where their policy is and have them show you that policy, because I would certainly hope that that policy isn't written down, because it would be in violation of the state law and the federal law.
Okay.
So I'd ask them for that policy first and foremost, and then if they give it to you or if they don't give it to you, then I would look at the IDEA, look at the state board rules. There should be links at the end of this presentation that you can copy on the Florida Department of Education, and they'll have some links to technical assistance and guidance.
Life coaches.
That might also depend on if the student had already met their high school graduation requirements and we're just returning to school because they're allowed.
No, it's a special needs school. The whole school is special needs.
I know, but
So if a child has received their diploma, they don't have any right to any special education.
No, they didn't.
But they can return.
No,
They can return
no
to school.
diplomas.
If they receive physically their diploma, they cannot. It is legally they don't have a right. If they have received a diploma in their hands, they're done. They've
No
graduated. They don't
diplomas,
have a
no,
right. Right.
nothing.
But if they have met criteria but have declined to receive the diploma, then they have a right to continue going. But they do still have a right to receive educational services, so they can at that point start doing dual enrollment college courses. And I have a lot of students who do that. So that is one important thing as far as transition services and graduation. Physically taking a diploma into your hands is receipt of a diploma and disqualifies you from special education services. And so what I always advise my clients is if you are not ready to leave, if you think that you need life skills or communication skills, independent living skills, or further education, even if that's just you don't think you are prepared to do math and reading at the college level without the support of a learning strategies class, do not accept that diploma. If they mail it to you, mail it back. I'm not ready to leave, I need continuing education.
My county, there's a lot of confusion going on in my county because they are doing, okay, you've met these, on your access points, you've met these credits, you're going to do deferment, and then you're no longer going to be in this class, you're no longer in part of the school, you have to now go somewhere else, and if you want to get these additional life skills. Is that something that you're seeing everywhere? It's kind of gotten very confusing.
Yeah, I'm not
With a
saying,
lot of parents, we're really quite confused because they keep on telling us, you know, when they hit 18, and they're using
Yeah, they're trying to
18.
push kids out of
What they're doing is they're saying, you're 18, you know, you have basically done all these credits, you no longer will come to this school at all.
We're seeing that too.
yeah, so the LRE gets a little tricky when you get up to 18 because there is no general education class for that age group. And so it's kind of like extended school year. There's no requirement during extended school year that they pull general education students in. And I made a joke in my ESY presentation. We don't have to kidnap gen ed kids in order to create that least restrictive environment of a gen ed classroom. But if a student is working on standards and there is a standards class that they could be in, there's no reason they couldn't be in that. It would be based on their individual needs. If a student is doing a life skills program and they would only be with, if they would be in a self-contained classroom, that gets to the kind of location discussion. There's no right to necessarily be on that physical location of the ordinary high school campus. They could be at a separate location. So it gets down to the individual consideration, but they should certainly still have a right to academic instruction based on their unique needs, and they should definitely still have a right to be attending some sort of program. I don't know if that
Because
answers
the
all.
confusion is, you know, now we're, you know, there's not supposed to be any kind of special diploma, so it's supposed to be, everybody's supposed to be working on their access points, but they're also supposed to, but it seems like what's happening is they're just pushing people through. So they're just saying, okay, you know, this is your age, this is what your grade is, you're doing this. It's almost like, okay, we're saying you do that, check, you're going, next.
My daughter's in diapers. They said she could be in food service. She could work in food service.
So what I would do then is I would have,
She's ready to work.
is she connected with Voc Rehab?
She uses a sippy cup. She can't hold a spoon, but she can work in food service.
Is she connected to Vocational Rehabilitation?
No.
So I would one, get connected with Vocational Rehabilitation.
I'm sorry.
So hang on. I'll explain the whole thing and then I'll go back and give you the terms. So I would be connected with Vocational Rehabilitation. I would have them do a vocational assessment, and I would have them look at what does this student need to be successful after high school in either a chosen employment goal or in post-secondary, if that's what is appropriate. And there are colleges or programs in the state that provide college level work or college access to college for students with disabilities, including students with learning disabilities. And so I would work with vocational rehabilitation or work with the colleges or work with the employers to determine what does the student need to be able to do to be successful there. And I would take that list to the high school and say, this is what they need to be able to do, this is what they can't do from that list. We need to work on that before they graduate. And if they're talking about food service and she can't use a spoon, how can she serve the food? You know, like I would
But
go through
the other side of that story is that I think they put that in to keep her at the school Because otherwise they can say, and this is what her liaison told me, they can say that she doesn't need to be at school after age 18 because there's no chance she's ever going to be a contributing working member of society. And the purpose of keeping her at school, it's a special needs school from 18 to 21, is that they're learning a life skill and she has no chance of ever working. That's why she explained it to me why we put in her IEP she can work in food service, because I questioned it naturally.
Yeah.
And that's his explanation to me, so I felt like, oh, well, if I fight this, then I'm costing my daughter 18 to 21, at school.
Yeah, so she's certainly entitled to 18 to 21, whether or not she's going for employment afterwards.
So that's baloney? Oh,
Yeah.
So, are you seeing what I think is happening is they're just pushing kids through? I have a kind of a semi-high functioning child, and long and short of it is he could be successful in a general ed if there were supports. I don't know if I'm willing to fight for those supports, but I want him, if he's on these access, I want him to be genuinely learning, because he can. And I'm just, I'm hearing this thing, oh, you're 18, pushed out, and it almost seems like I'm getting, I've just got this nagging feeling that I'm just not seeing that. How do I know he's really getting what the education he's supposed to be getting? Because it just seems like now it's getting pushed through.
Yeah, so you could also get connected with Vocational Rehabilitation, and in doing their vocational assessments, they would also most likely do a psychological assessment in order to determine levels of educational performance, and that would be kind of a way to double check the school's numbers, see whether it's really being pushed along. And like I said, you could look into some of those programs because there are colleges that are accepting students who have been on access points, but
I'm one of those moms that goes way in advance, so I mean, I know that. It's just, I'm also trying, I've been out of the school system for his entire life, basically, because I just got tired of fighting and I went the private school route. But the reality is with our kids, as they get older, the access of true academic schools gets less and less once they get into that high school level, at least for me, where I live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things and the reason that I do what I do is that the IDEA provides all these protections for students and for parents, and it really protects students in public schools, and so I want to make sure that someone is there fighting the districts in order to make sure that they're meeting their obligations, and that because there's nothing that requires private schools to do anything. There's nothing that requires private schools to meet up to 21.
You have to walk with your feet, you vote with your feet, yes, exactly.
Okay. Oh, the goal is to put the child in the closest possible school to their home, and in the school they're entitled if not disabled. And so what that means is if there is not a program, if the student is in a separate class for deaf and hard of hearing where they're using sign language, and there isn't a program for that at their school, you look for the next closest. You want them to be with their peers as much as possible. You don't want them to be clear on the other side of the Related services. So related services are services that students need to benefit from special education. So speech, occupational, physical therapy, transportation, counseling. It's supplementary aids and services then are to help a student be integrated with non-disabled students to the maximum extent appropriate. And the example of that would be, like I said, maybe an aid, a person who's an aid, or an assistive technology device, or the use of speech-to-text software.
Who determines how often they get OT, PT, all that stuff?
It would be based on an occupational physical therapy evaluation.
So the teacher who's giving the therapy tells you they're getting, like our vision teacher said, your daughter is blind, but I don't think she needs to use the cane, so she doesn't need vision services anymore. of the fireworks were going off in my brain. But I felt like if she's the one doing the evaluation, it's not fair.
Right. So I'm going to revise my previous recommendation. If she's visually impaired, you'd want to contact the Division of Blind Services.
She is from the Division of Blind Services.
Okay, and that's the one who did the evaluation?
Yes, it's not fair, because she's the one who's doing it, and she's the one who's
do their own evaluation?
She comes to the school, and so it's inconvenient to her to have to come to the school for one child, and we disagree.
Right.
You know, so when you disagree with the one person who makes the evaluation and the determination and everything,
Then that's when you would do those independent educational evaluations.
Independent.
that previous slide. Okay, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So speech and language therapy is provided by a qualified speech and language pathologist, which is abbreviated oftentimes as SLP, to help students access their education. An SLP can work with trouble swallowing, oral motor skills, clarity of speech, language use, and acquisition. They might also work on sign language skills or the use of assistive technology to communicate. An SLP's goal is to make sure students have the skills that are necessary to understand others and to communicate in the school environment. AT, Assistive Technology, is a device used by an individual with a disability to perform functions that might be difficult or impossible. I don't know what, oh yeah, it's on the slide. Straws. Straws are assistive technology. The big movement about saving maternals has been really inconvenient for some students with disabilities because there is beginning to be a stigma against using straws, but that's assistive technology. Some students are not able to lift a cup up to their mouth. Some students need to be able to lean over and use a straw. Some students need to use an iPad for communication or some other type of device for communication. Some students need a cane. Some students need, assistive technology is anything that helps a student access their environment. The team should consider the student's needs and should begin with low-tech options and progress up. And any assistive technology needs should be in the IEP, should be provided in a timely manner, and should not cost the parents any money. The district is also responsible for replacement and repair. Parents should be responsible for that. And then the other thing that I always advise people to consider is that with assistive technology, our world is becoming increasingly tech dependent. I have an Apple Watch and a phone and a computer, and so if a student can use an Apple Watch for communication or an iPhone for communication, then that's an assistive technology that wouldn't make them stand out from their peers. It would be easy for other people to understand. It would be easy for the student to understand. It would make it a seamless transition and a seamless use of that technology for them. And oftentimes students are concerned about looking different. Well, if they're able to use something that their peers are using, that society generally understands to be used for that purpose, it can make it easier for them to use that assistive technology. PT, physical therapy. School-based physical therapy requires a medical diagnosis, so this one there is going to have to be something from an actual doctor saying it's necessary. Physical therapy addresses gross motor skills and ability to access the educational environment. I think OT is my next slide. Yeah. So physical therapy is kind of a big movement, walking from this side of the room to the other, or ability to stand up and sit down, ability to squat, ability to bend over, things like that. Physical therapy, it can be climbing stairs, navigating between classes, positioning in a chair if a student is in a wheelchair, or accessing the playground at recess. It's tailored to the individual child, and an important thing with these related services is it has to be necessary for you to access your environment, or to access your education. And so when I was in school, and this is a true story, I couldn't stand flat on my feet because there was a tendon in my leg that was too short. But I could access my education walking on tiptoes, and I did physical therapy outside of school because I was able to access it. Wasn't a barrier to my education, and so it wasn't something that needed to be addressed at school, and my education was able to be addressed separately from that. So the team really needs to discuss, is it getting in the way of the student navigating hallways? Is it getting in their way of climbing stairs? Is it getting in their way? Is it impacting their ability to navigate around school or access their education? And if it's not, then it's something that maybe doesn't necessarily need to be discussed at school, although it is still important for it to be discussed and addressed for that student. It might be something that should be done privately. Occupational therapy. So physical therapy, like I said, standing up, sitting down, bending over, walking to the other side of the room. Occupational therapy, using using a straw, using a spoon, using a pencil, writing. That's occupational therapy. PT's gross motor skills, OT's fine motor skills. So it might be grip, it might be typing on a keyboard, it might be just moving your paper around, or being able to hold your paper firm while you write so that it doesn't slide all over your desk. An occupational therapist might also discuss a sensory diet, which means a way of planning out for a student's sensory needs. So oftentimes students will have fidget spinners or something that they can sit on that will enable them to fidget around at their desk, or something that they can put their feet on if they're constantly swinging, that they need sensory output during their day. This sensory diet can help them get that output and hopefully reduce instances of behavior as communication. ESY, extended school year. I just gave an hour-long presentation on this before, so I'm going to now try and sum it up into a couple slides here. If you want more information, if you want the hour-long version, I think I have a couple extra handouts. You can get those from me. But it's special education and related services beyond the school year in accordance with the IEP, and there's still at no cost to the parents. Beyond the school year means, like I've said I think a couple times in here, it could be before or after school, it could be during breaks, including the winter and summer breaks, or winter and spring breaks, and absolutely during the summer break as well. It can be based at school, or it could be on-the-job support or services through the community. So if a student needs social skills, it can be a program that is designed in order to get them those social or communication skills. If a student needs a behavior therapy, it can be designed to do that. If a student needs, is a transition age student who needs to have practical on-the-job experience in order to work in food service, it can be something where if the student is unable to go to that environment alone, the aide would go with them, or someone from the school, a job coach would go with them in order to begin to support them in that environment. IEP amendments.
Oh, excuse me, is ABA therapy not a related service now? Are we done with related services?
Oh, those were the acronyms, that the common acronyms. This isn't, yeah. Behavior therapy, behavior is definitely something that can still be addressed. And I think there are a couple behavior slides, but I didn't specifically get into ABA.
Another question, you mentioned you couldn't stand flat. I didn't hear, it sounded like you couldn't stand flat on the beam.
Feet, just on
On your feet, of course.
Yeah, that's just an example. Like a student, for example, a student who breaks their foot, but is able to navigate on crutches, or is able, they wouldn't necessarily need specially designed instruction in physical therapy to recover. They'll need it because if you've got your foot in a cast for 2 months, you're going to need physical therapy to learn how to walk on it again or whatever. But that's not necessarily something that impacts your education, and so you do that privately with your doctor and not during school day. So IEP amendments. The team should meet annually to review the IEP, at least annually. But the team can meet more often than that if it's necessary, if there are changes in the student's behavior, or if there aren't changes in the student's progress, if a student meets all of their IEP goals and it's only March. We'd want to meet and adjust those goals. We wouldn't necessarily want to wait until May and say, well, we're just going to keep working on these ones. They're achieved, let's start working on the next thing.
How do you know if they've been met?
There should be progress, quarterly progress with each of the report cards. There should be a showing of how the student is progressing towards their goals. And if there's not, that's something that could be requested in the IEP. You can also request more frequent monitoring of goals if that's appropriate.
Ah, thank you.
And then I think the last point I want to make from this slide is the school can amend the IEP without reconvening the team. So if everyone can agree that the goal has been met, and everyone can agree in writing that the next appropriate goal is, if we're going based on the standards, and the student's goal was to get to the beginning third grade level. If everyone's in agreement, it can be done in email, and the parent, as the parent, can waive the right to the meeting. I think it's always helpful to be there to discuss progress, but there are some situations, if a student needed some accommodation based on, like I said, being on crutches or something like that for some amount of time, you could agree to amend the IEP and take out that service without having a meeting.
If you want to have a meeting, what do you call that? Because I've requested meetings and been ignored because I didn't use the right term. Like if I write an email saying I'm officially requesting an IEP meeting to discuss. such and such?
I call it, so there shouldn't be any necessary terminology to trigger that. Like, you should be able to, and there's some dispute resolution stuff in here, so you should be able to say they've denied the request for you have a right to request a meeting at any time. And you should be able to say, I requested a meeting and they ignored me. That's a denial of my request as a parent to have an IEP.
Just request an IEP meeting, it's enough to use that term, I request an IEP meeting.
Yeah, that should be enough. If you
I was
want
told I had to request a reevaluation.
an interim,
An interim?
you wouldn't have to use that word, but
They should know what's the meaning, I mean.
so the thing is you can request an IEP meeting at any time. So who cares if it's interim or if you're just requesting a meeting, you have a right to request it at any time.
I just heard some districts say that.
Yeah, and then they'll call it that, because that's the word for you have your annual IEP meeting, which happens once a year.
Right.
And the title that they give it, or the way it looks on their software when they print out more than one IEP a year, the title it gets at the top is interim, but an IEP meeting is an IEP meeting is an IEP meeting. You just request an IEP meeting and they call it whatever they want to call it, but they clearly know you want one because you
Email
asked
enough,
for
should I
one.
have done a letter?
An email is perfect because you can print it off at any time. Got proof that you sent it.
So frustrating.
Yeah,
CC the administrator.
That is CCing the administrator.
yeah.
I use the term official. Sorry.
No worries.
Sarasota.
Reevaluations. So reevaluations should happen every 3 years unless the team is in agreement not to reevaluate. And what that would mean is, so reevaluations look at whether a student continues to be eligible. There are certain disabilities that you have if you haven't applied. If nothing has changed, you don't need to, if you're deaf. I don't think we need to recheck your hearing. You are unable to hear, you remain eligible. We could all agree, we're good, student remains eligible, student remains unable to access their education, student continues to need services. There are certain disabilities where a reevaluation might be appropriate. So a student has ADHD, it's affecting them one way when they're 6, it's affecting them another way when they're 9, it's affecting them another way maybe even when they're 11. It hasn't been 3 years yet, but they've switched from elementary to middle school. There are more changes. They might be impacted differently, and so we might not want to wait another year. We might want to do it sooner. So reevaluations, like everything else, is individualized. If you have a disability that the team agrees, we don't need to discuss. Fine, skip them. Every 3 years you sign a form that says the team agrees that we don't need to reevaluate. If you have a disability that's constantly changing, or if you develop a new disability, maybe you didn't have an anxiety diagnosis when you were younger, but when you're 15, there's something that's changing. You might need another evaluation. Once a year, unless the school and parent agree. Transition. So I discussed a little bit of this already. No later than age 15, and I suggest you start at 14. The IEP team start discussing the students' plans for after graduation. Are they going to job training or technical school? Are they going to be employed? Are they going to college? And you have to have goals that work towards that post-secondary goal, and you have to provide services necessary to help them achieve that goal. So if a student wants to go to college and they want to go live in a dorm, are they able to do that? Are they able to live independently? Are they able to manage money? Are they able to navigate public transportation? And if not, those are goals that the team can work on. The student must be invited to these meetings. So I think I mentioned earlier when discussing the IEP team, the level to which I recommend that a student be involved in their meeting changes as they get older. Certainly when they're transitioned, they must be invited to the meeting. And I think it's important for them to begin to be a self-advocate, and to be, especially because the student is the one who gets to decide what they want to do after high school. So we got to ask them what they want to do. We got to include them in the discussion. The goals should be based on the student's individual needs, strengths, interests, and preferences. If the student says, I don't want to go to beauty school, we should not write them a transition plan for going to beauty school. It can include community experiences and the development of daily living skills. So toileting, self-care, money management, public transportation, and how to navigate it. Discipline of students with disabilities. So if a student with a disability violates the school district's discipline code, he or she cannot be suspended for more than 10 consecutive school days. The school district gets 10, we call them FAPE-free days, and then they have to begin providing services. So if a student gets a 15-day suspension, you get 10 days, and then the district has to provide education for those last 5. Removal for 10 consecutive days is considered a change of placement. If you are removed for 2 days in August, 2 days in September, and 7 days in November, you've also hit 10 days, and that could also be considered a change of placement. When a child with a disability is removed from their classroom for more than 10 days, there has to be a manifestation determination review, and this is what Lauren was alluding to earlier. When a child with a disability is disciplined, and longer than 10 days, either 10 days at a time or 10 days over the course of the school year, you look at whether the behavior was caused by or had a direct and substantial relationship to the disability. And if it did, then it's a manifestation and the student cannot be punished. They still get those 10 FAPE-free days. So there's a maximum of 10 days during the school year that the school gets a pass to not provide education. If it is not a manifestation, that happens. If it is a manifestation, then they immediately get returned to school. They don't get to do those things. If the behavior was the result of the school district's failure to implement the IEP, again, as soon as the team meets, as soon as the team determines this, the student returns to school. If they've already missed 10, that doesn't have to be made up. But as soon as the team determines that either it was caused by or had a direct and substantial relationship to the disability, or it was the result of a failure to implement the IEP, the kid gets returned, the kid starts getting services. There's an exception for weapons, drugs, infliction of serious bodily injury. Serious bodily injury is a high standard. If a 5-year-old punches a teacher in the shin, that is not serious bodily injury. If an 18-year-old takes an X-Acto knife and somehow hurts the teacher, potentially serious bodily injury. It's a very different standard than what teachers might sometimes argue. So you have to look at, is it really a serious bodily injury? Is it a paper cut, or is it, something more serious, broken bone? Dispute resolution. If you disagree with a decision made by the district, or if you disagree that the district, about a request that you've made that they've denied, you have a right to dispute resolution. That can come in the form of a state complaint, a due process complaint, or an alternative dispute resolution. And so alternative dispute resolution is a way outside of the normal complaint process or court process to resolve disputes. Information can be found at the Florida Department of Education website, and there's a link there in your packet. And I think I'm out of time. So I don't know. The information is here. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions about the complaint process. I know there is a presentation that my supervisor is doing, and I should plug for her tomorrow at 4 o'clock, just on these dispute resolution processes. So if you do have questions, you can see her at 4, or you can grab her PowerPoint. It should be available at the table. And there's also information on our website, which is linked.
Before you file a complaint, do you need something from the school district?
Do you mean like permission?
No, like a denial, or or is it enough that they ignore you?
Well,
It's enough that they ignore you.
could she do a complaint?
Yeah, you can print off those emails.
Yeah.
Yeah, you print off your emails that you sent. It's always easier to prove with emails than with phone calls, because it's difficult to prove that you called somebody. But especially if you have an email that goes unanswered, that right there is enough to probably trigger an investigation, because you have all of these emails, and then the state could reach out to them if, say, you file a state complaint. State can reach out to the district
I
and
just
say,
like to go through the process. I don't like to skip stages and then I get well, why didn't you ask them?
So, just quickly, I think that these are all, our website there, Disability Rights Florida, there's a link that says resources, and if you go under resources, it says disability topics, and there's links to a lot of these different topics if you have questions. The Florida Department of Education website has more information. Rights Law is a great resource that we use for special education issues. And then our contact information if you have other questions.
Do you guys have teachers? Sorry. Special education teachers, can they reach out to you? Or is it just for parents?
Our services are for parents, but we can provide trainings, I mean, like this training to
If
districts.
they
and
have
district
questions, this, my question about the teacher and the coach is from a teacher.
I don't know what we would do with that kind of call. They can
Yeah.
call and intake can decide who to refer them to.
Okay, sorry.
Are the presentations from this weekend going to be posted on there?
They should be. I'd like them to be. This one was recorded, so
Because I'm
it's
just
going
going to
somewhere.
all of them, but, you know, there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And the Disability Rights Network, the National Disability Rights Network, are you all a part of that? So
I
all the
just got
different
back from
states
their
are all
conference.
coming back, yeah.
Yeah.
Because my daughters have a rare disease, and so that nationwide families are asking different questions, and so that I'm just thinking that could be a good resource. Okay. And one other question. For individual education plans, are those federal rules, or are they?
There
are
are
differences
state
within the
rules, but
state?
the basic protection comes from federal law.
Okay, similar to 504, the federal protections. But
And the
they're,
way that works is the federal law has certain requirements, and a district must comply with those requirements. If a state can add more protections, but they can't take anything away.
correct, yes. Okay.
Can you, in an IEP, my son has sensory issues and an intellectual disability, but the reality of life is, once he's through the school day, his brain is like mush, okay? It just doesn't work, okay? Now he's going into high school. We used to get up early to get homework done, but now going to high school, that's just not going to be physically possible with them starting so early. Can you, in an IEP, say that there's not going to be any homework? I know.
It depends. You can certainly reduce assignments. You can certainly limit questions. You can do only those things necessary to demonstrate achievement or understanding. But since homework is a way to practice skills and develop skills, it's difficult to say that you shouldn't have any.
Can you request that he has an independent study at school where he gets his homework completed? I don't know. I'm a daughter of a teacher, so I believe in education. I'm one who believes that I don't think they're going to be, they're trying to push them through, not getting education. But I just know, I mean, he literally is like a deer in the headlights. I mean, there's just like nothing going on. My mother, who's the teacher, would try to do homework with him, and she's like, he's just totally just blank, he's not getting it. And then I work on it the next morning, he's like, gets right through it. So I know there's a real issue, but I don't know how to address that issue.
Yeah, well, one thing we could look at too is whether there's a way of addressing the setting that he's in at school, and I don't mean the environment, the least restrictive environment, I mean the sensory input that he's getting. If there's a way to give him either a coping skill, reduce the sensory environment or the sensory distractions or stressors in order to make him better able to cope throughout the school day so that he is able to do something when he gets home. If there are ways that he can take sensory breaks, if there are ways that he can do something during the day to relieve some of that tension before it all bottles up to a point where he's unable to be productive once he comes home.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Does he get extended time on homework? Like, is he allowed to turn it in later?
Doesn't matter, because honestly, it does, if you are not there, and it's, I mean, literally, his brain is mush. I mean, there's just no processing going on. And it's not a behavior thing, because he's got it there, he's trying, but it's just like, and the school teachers that they had in this year, they said it, they see it throughout the day, that all of a sudden, they're like, he knows this, I know he knows it, I've seen him do it. He's not he's not having a negative behavior or anything, he's very much a pleaser, and he's just, it's like no lights are on. And so, I know it's an issue, and I don't know how to address it going forward in the public school system in high school.
Right.
Because like I said, we used to do it by accommodating, by getting them at 5 o'clock.